I first got serious about music actually when I was about 11 or 12 years old, and it was primarily electronic music. So because, I suppose it's a cliche really, but because I was interested in astronomy and then I got interested in physics, I got interested in synthesizers and the technology of music. And so I formed a band with a friend of mine, and really I couldn't play. So I'm self-taught essentially. And I taught myself to play keyboards, not because of any, at the time, deep love of music, but just really a deep love of electronics, I would say. And also, a bit later on, I really decided that I wanted to be in a band. And my musical history is that when I was about 17, I'd recorded some demos, as many people do. And I was lucky because a guy from Thin Lizzy, the band Thin Lizzy, had moved in down the road and went in the same pub as my dad in Oldham near Manchester. And so he gave Darren Wharton, his name was, a demo tape, which wasn't very good. But when Thin Lizzy split up and Darren formed a band, he remembered that there was a guy up the road who he thought looked all right and seemed to be able to play keyboards a bit, and invited me to join the band. And so I found myself, instead of going to university at the age of 18, I found myself in a band, and we got a record deal and made a couple of albums. And my first professional gig actually was supporting Jimmy Page, of all people. So I went in at the top. Yeah. And the album, actually our first album was recorded mainly in Los Angeles with a producer called Larry Klein, who was married to Joni Mitchell at the time. And so we recorded quite a lot of the album in Joni Mitchell's studio in Los Angeles. So I had quite an introduction to professional music, but that was rock music, of course.
Yeah. So the music sort of came after science, because you've said in interviews many times before about watching Cosmos at 11 or 12 and how that was a major kind of moment for you.
Yeah, I'd always been interested in astronomy, and Carl Sagan's Cosmos was broadcast in, I think it was 1979 or 1980, so I was 11 or 12. And it was the perfect time because, and to this day, I think Cosmos is one of, if not the greatest science documentary series, because, and this is the thing that really connected with me, it's not just about astronomy or the exploration of the planets or the wider universe. It's also about what that exploration means for us, for our civilization. So it immediately connected the stars and the things that captured my imagination out there in space with our situation here on Earth. And that's always stayed with me. And that's actually a central part of the show here at Sydney Opera House, because to me, cosmology and astronomy raise profound questions that we have, as a civilization, been trying to answer for centuries, right, if not millennia. And they're questions about our existence. I start the show by saying, what does it mean to live a finite, fragile life in an infinite, eternal universe? Which I so often joke is the only interesting question in philosophy. I don't really mean that. So if any philosophers are listening, it's kind of a joke. But if you think about it, it probably is the question which resonates through the history of philosophy. What does it mean? And the interesting thing for me, about astronomy and cosmology is it frames that question. It places that question in the arena of reality, if you like. It tells us that we are one planet around one star amongst 400 billion stars in the Milky Way galaxy, which is itself one of 2 trillion galaxies in the observable universe, which is itself a small patch of what exists. And as I'll discuss in the show, maybe even our universe itself, which goes way beyond the horizon, might be one of a potentially infinite number of universes. So we are definitely small, right? There's no doubt about that. But the question is, and this is the question that we address head on in the show with music and philosophy and art and science, The question is, does that mean that we are insignificant? And I won't give away the answer. But you might guess it's not going to be yes. We are. Yeah, yes, we are insignificant. That's the end of it. Good night. It's not. That's not going to be the answer.
It'll be a very short presentation.
Yeah. What's the point?
Meet me at the bar later for an extension on this thesis. Well, it's interesting because, I mean, with apologies to the philosophers, that question is sort of addressed by, on the other side of the coin, by nihilism and fatalism, which sort of hold that, well, this is it, so what's the point? But you have a more optimistic view, or a more, I suppose, enthusiastic response to that question.
Yeah, and I do, and but also I think this show, I hope and expect, is going to be more than the sum of its parts, because there is a scientific answer, but there's also an emotional answer. There's an artistic answer, a reaction to that question. And I strongly believe, actually, that composers such as Mahler and Strauss have given quite plausible answers to that question. I mean, you see it, I think, for me anyway, in Mahler 10, you see this. I read the first movement in particular as just being not only an accommodation with the certainty that your life is finite and fragile, but actually a celebration of it, I think. And so we don't use Mahler 10 actually in the concert because it's too long, essentially. So we use the Adagietto from Mahler 5 instead. But Strauss, again, the wonderful thing about Zarathustra is that argument plays out and ends ambiguously. And both myself and Ben Northey, felt that was a very powerful place after we've delivered all these arguments and had all these arguments musically and scientifically and graphically well, I won't give the end away, but I still put my spin on it. But I think there is clearly, anyone who claims to have the answer to the meaning of life should not be on a stage here, right? I always joke, actually. I say sometimes to audiences, I'm not going to tell you what the meaning of life is. If I knew, I'd charge more for tickets. Right? So, but what I hope is that by juxtaposing some of the greatest music ever written for an orchestra, and music that specifically, we think addresses these questions, and juxtaposing that with what we know about the universe and some things we don't know. So I talk about the nature of space and time themselves, for example. And if we're talking about the beginning of time or the end of time in the centers of black holes, the beginning of time at the origin of the universe, perhaps if the universe had an origin, you need to know what time is. And when you say, what is time, that almost sounds like a purely philosophical question. But actually, and I deal with this in the show, in the study of black holes, we've been forced into asking that question scientifically, which is a remarkable thing. So now we're beginning to talk in terms of building blocks of space and time. And I think that the idea really of this show is you need to, if you're going to even begin to approach these questions in any kind of sensible way, these big questions about existence, you need to know what reality is. So it's kind of a prerequisite. It is, in scientific language, necessary but not sufficient to know what our reality is. What are the building blocks of reality? How big is it? How old is it? You need to know those things. And we're beginning to know those things. We have an advantage, actually. So Zarathustra, of course, is based on Nietzsche's book, also Sprach Zarathustra. And the bit that people know is just Sunrise from 2001, the opening of 2001. But it's a beautiful piece that follows. It's Strauss's interpretation of Nietzsche's book. But we have an advantage over Nietzsche because Nietzsche didn't know anything, right? Scientifically, when he wrote that book, Because we're talking about the end of the 19th century. And if you go to the end of the 19th century, we didn't know there were any galaxies beyond our own. We didn't know the universe had a beginning or something that looks like an origin, at least at the Big Bang. We had no idea about the size and scale and strangeness of reality. And so now, in a way, over 100 years later, we have an advantage. However, the questions that he posed and attempted to answer are as irrelevant now as they were then. We just have a bit more information. So this is, so you could say this show is Nietzsche would have, I like to think Nietzsche would have loved it, right? Because he would have said, oh, wow, really? That was necessary to know. If I'm, as Ben Northey said to me, the show, in his words, he said, we're attempting to answer a question, or at least approach a question, which is, how does humanity justify its existence when faced with the infinite power of nature? It's a good question. And that's what we're grappling with.
Well, a good goal to have, absolutely.
Yeah.
A man's reach should exceed his grasp.
It's not without ambition.
Yeah. Well, I wonder if Nietzsche wouldn't have just reinforced his thesis that if, we are this small in the face of all of that additional nothingness, then, even more reason to believe that we are in fact God and we're in control of everything. And,
Yeah. I mean, my view is that the answers to these questions, which, as I've said, we don't know, but the answers, if they exist, lie in the intersection of ideas that appear at first sight to be contradictory. There are two in this show, really. One is that we are physically insignificant, but the second is that we might be unimaginably valuable, notwithstanding that physical insignificance. And that's when we start to explore life, the origin of life, and the origin of complex life on Earth, and ask questions such as, well, how many civilizations might there be in a typical galaxy? And I argue that meaning, whatever meaning is, it exists because the universe clearly means something to us. So each of us understands what meaning is. But meaning is a property of complex biological systems, I argue. So without structures such as, for example, human brains, I would argue that there is no meaning in the universe. So I think life brings meaning to the universe. And so if it is the case that there are very few civilizations per galaxy, then there are very few islands of meaning in a typical galaxy like the Milky Way. This island of 400 billion stars, it's 100,000 light years across, this thing, right? It's a big structure. But let's imagine that we are the only civilization in the Milky Way galaxy, for example. That's a possibility. And I argue, or I don't argue for it, but I present the evidence that we could use to come to that guess. It's not a conclusion, but it's a possibility. So let's accept it. Let's say that the possibility is true and we are the only civilization currently present in the Milky Way. That means, I would argue, that the Earth is the only island of meaning in a sea of 400 billion suns. And suddenly then you find that you have a different perspective on existence. Because it does mean that if we destroy this civilization through inaction or even deliberate action, then we might eliminate meaning in a galaxy of 400 billion suns forever. And that's, that means that I think we have a responsibility because it's a reasonable working assumption, I think. Might not be right. I mean, I've said to, when I'm on social media and things and people say, well, no, but the UFOs have landed, haven't they? It's like, well, I don't think the UFOs have landed. But I wouldn't be surprised if one did, in a scientific sense. Yeah. If one landed and it hovered down above the Sydney Opera House now, when I walked outside, then I'd be, that explains a lot. because there's one of the interesting sort of debates or ideas in science is known as the Fermi paradox, The Fermi paradox, simply stated, named after the great scientist Enrico Fermi, by the way, is where are they? Because if life is reasonably common in a galaxy such as ours, and the galaxy is pretty much as old as the universe, 13 billion years or so old, and there are trillions of planets in the Milky Way. So it would seem there's been plenty of space and plenty of time for civilizations to arise. And yet, as far as we can tell, not one of them has left any trace of its existence. And you would expect that if a civilization became even slightly more advanced than ours, imagine us if we last another 1,000 years or 2,000 years or 10,000 years or 100,000 years or 1,000,000 years. It's a blink of an eye in the history of the galaxy. Imagine where we will be in 1,000,000 years, given that we've only been around for about 250,000 years or something like that as a species, right? So imagine where we would be. You would think that we would be visible on the sky. And yet there is no one visible on the sky as far as we can tell. So that might imply that there aren't many civilizations. Perhaps there have never been any civilizations in the Milky Way. So we don't know before everyone starts tweeting at me. I'm happy to say that I don't know, but it's a working assumption. And for the purposes of this exploration of what it means to be human here at the Opera House, then that's one of the avenues that we will explore.
I always find the possible answers to the Fermi paradox possibly more concerning than the thought that we are in fact alone in an endless universe. What if we're not alone and they're watching? What if we're not alone and they've decided not to make contact? What if they're already here? All of these are profoundly unsettling.
Yeah, they are. Yeah, Arthur C. Clarke famously said there are only two answers to the question, are we alone in the universe? It's yes and no, and both are terrifying.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I wanted to ask you more specifically about where the the idea for this show came from, and the idea of using classical music and orchestral music. What is it about classical music, orchestral music, whatever you want to call it, that you think helps address this question?
Well, the idea came from the big arena shows that I did. I did in Sydney here last year, actually. And that show opened with Sibelius, the Fifth Symphony, Third Movement. And the reason is that a good friend of mine, the conductor Daniel Harding, we had a long conversation about the meaning of life, probably over a drink or two somewhere. And we got to talking about 2001, which is, the more you analyse it, it's basically Nietzsche. And it's basically Strauss's interpretation of Nietzsche, actually, I would say. And I said to Daniel, what should Kubrick have used in 2001, kind of as a joke? And he immediately said Sibelius, Fifth Symphony, Third Movement. And I agreed immediately. And so we'd already constructed a kind of a mini version of 2001, which you'll see at the Opera House, over that music. And so I'd always felt that an extension of those ideas, with the music played live, and really the music, or me as a proxy for science and what we understand, engaging in a conversation with those composers and that music to see what comes out. And I should emphasize, I don't really know what's going to come out because we've not done it yet. So my hope is that at the first performance, then this dialogue creates something, creates some sort of hints at answers that maybe, or probably not answers, but some different perspectives on this problem that I and the orchestra hadn't thought of. So that's what I hope, right? But the answer is why that music? I think because these brilliant artists, Sibelius being one, Mahler, Strauss, these artists have wrestled with the questions that are raised by cosmology and astronomy, or similar questions the nature of existence, the nature of the finite time that we have on Earth. Famously, Mahler was interested in that question. So I think these are eloquent explorations of the problems that are raised when you sit there and think about the scale of reality and the strangeness of reality. And so that's really where the idea came from. It was what happens when you smash these two very different disciplines together. And maybe that's the wrong metaphor, really, smash them together. It's allow them to intertwine and talk to each other and see what kind of thing emerges.
Yeah, and to sort of exist side by side and see what comes out of that juxtaposition.
Yeah. Because, Sibelius famously, I mean, that piece of music famously at one level is about swans taken up from a lake. But at another level, explicitly, it's about the beauty, majesty and power of nature, as is Zarathustra, of course, the whole thing, and about our attempts to find answers. And we follow, so the second act really is Zarathustra, pretty much all of it, interwoven with the ideas from cosmology and astronomy. And so I think they fit. They not only fit well, but they, I think, enhance each other.
I've always felt, it was funny when I saw the pieces that were going to be in this piece, because the Mahler 5 Adagietto to me has always felt like sort of a loneliness and isolation in a vast void. Those strings just kind of keening away. It's sort of crushingly sad and lonely, and yet has been used for moments of great empathy and pathos ever since it was written. It's one of those pieces that seems to kind of hold anything you need from it.
Yeah, and what's interesting is we chose that. It's the end of Act 1, and we chose. It's just when we've been really introduced to the scale and beauty of the universe, and so we cut that with images of galaxies, essentially. So from the Hubble Space Telescope, the JWST, the successor of Hubble, and it just changes the music. Again, Ben said to me when he saw the cut of the film that we have over that piece, that it just takes it somewhere else. And one of the things I'm looking forward to, actually, and I've done this before when I work with orchestras, is that we're going to have them watch it. So in rehearsal, it's interesting to see how the performance changes when you add different ideas and different images into the music. As you said, it can take on different lives, that piece of music, which is part of the genius of Mahler, of course.
Absolutely.
And so it does when just these enormous islands of stars that have been contextualized through the first act. I think just it's quite a transcendent thing, actually, to see it on the screen. And of course we've because it's me. There's an element of the old rock and roll kind of person in me. So I wanted as much LED as the roof here could hold. So I've gone sort of stadium rock with the LED screens. It's like, how much is your weight limit? Because that's basically it. So when you come to see the show, that's as much LED as you can hang without breaking it. Because we said, don't break that roof. Yeah. It's only just been refurbished.
Well, they just put in a whole bunch more reinforced steel into the roof during the renovation. So
we're going to see if that works.
Yeah. Real life stress test. Well, I thought it's interesting you bring up the way that different visuals can change the way you feel about a piece of music, because I had quite a profound reaction to watching your Planets Holst video and the way that you recontextualize Mars and present a different view of what it might mean, given how much more we've learned about Mars in the century since Holst wrote it.
Yeah, because Holst, it was partly astrological. It was and sort of it's an interesting piece of music, and it's also challenging to perform, I think, and try and give it a new slant or raise new questions because it's so well known. And so Mars, this idea, this god of war. So it was what we tried to do was, well, if you think of Mars now, what we know about Mars is it's the most likely place for life beyond Earth in the solar system, arguably. Although if you say that to planetary scientists, then they start fighting, because there are some people who think that Europa, Jupiter's moon, is the most likely place, and some people think Enceladus, Saturn's moon, is the most likely place, right? But Mars is the one we've explored the most. And we know that if you go back 4 billion years or so, it was Earth-like. So potentially a place where there could have been a second Genesis in the solar system. And also it is the only place really that I think humans can envisage inhabiting in the solar system beyond Earth. Perhaps the moon as well, but in terms of planets, it's the only place. So it takes on, it's a sort of it can be a symbol of hope, Mars. Not only in our quest to answer the question, are we alone in the universe, but also as a potential destination for us in the future, a first stepping stone, if you like, out to the stars. So if you put those ideas against Holst's music, which has become, after the fact, synonymous with, for example, mechanized warfare and the horrors of the First World War and so on, then I think it changes the music, and you can see hope in it. So the same with Jupiter, actually. There's this hymn, which then got the lyrics, I vow to thee my country. Everybody knows that hymn. And it became this kind of nationalistic sort of anthem, But there's more to it than that when you set it against these ideas that are raised, I think. So it was interesting with something as well known as the planets to try and recontextualize it and see if that music can be. It's this idea of a dialogue. No, we're not claiming. It's not. These ideas weren't present in Holst's mind, right? He didn't know anything about Mars at all. He knew nothing, but. Not because he was. It's not his fault, by the way. It's when he was writing. We knew nothing about the place, so now I'm not having to go at Holst.
That was going to be my headline.
If he could have just read a book, but of course that knowledge didn't exist. So it's really it's what I said earlier about hopefully when you put that music against these ideas, which are very modern ideas, then something emerges, hopefully. And you don't quite know what it's going to be. And that's why, until the first performance, when we set Mahler and Zarathustra and Westlake as well, we've got the beautiful Starry Messenger, which is used as a journey through the planets. So and it's interesting immediately because it's Galileo. And Galileo had seen the moons of Jupiter when he first built a telescope. And it's a powerful thing today if you look through a telescope to look at the moons of Jupiter, because what you see is that they're obviously going around it. It's just 5 seconds with a small telescope, and you can see these things, and you can say that they're orbiting around that. They're not orbiting around us. So immediately you see that Earth is not at the centre of the universe. You see it in 5 seconds. And so that it's interesting to juxtapose that celebration of Galileo with what we know now about the solar system and the wider universe. So that works beautifully, I think, as well. But then when we get into second act with Zarathustra, I'm really fascinated with what's going to happen, because there's the beautiful sort of exploration, then rejection of religion. There's an exploration and rejection of science, or at least the science in its cold form, I think. And so those arguments, and then the very powerful sort of ambiguous ending which I think once we've had chance to go through the 2 hours of music and argument, and then you set that ending against that argument in the context of the argument that we've made, which is by myself and Ben Northey and the orchestra. So we'll set up a debate, really, and then we'll see what the music delivers at the end in that context. It's going to be really interesting and exciting. You can see it's almost like I could do that. I said to Ben, actually, we could almost do it. We don't even, if someone would just give us the opera house and the orchestra, then we could have this little thing ourselves. We could just sit there and go, I wonder what's going to happen here. This is cool. But of course, it'll be great to invite an audience to participate in this experiment.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you could do the experiment on your own in some sense. Actually.
Yeah, that'd be
great.
But
you need the orchestra.
Yeah.
To answer these very deepest of questions about existence, we try in many ways. We have science, which certainly describes the stage. So defines the arena within which we have to have these conversations and debates. But it doesn't. It's necessary, but not sufficient. Then music is necessary, but not sufficient. And the visual arts are necessary, but not sufficient. And philosophy is necessary, but not sufficient. And theology is necessary, but not sufficient. They're all necessary, but not sufficient. And so the idea of this performance is to bring as many of those things together, all of which are necessary and none of which are sufficient, to see how we can perhaps add a little bit to this conversation that has been going on for many thousands of years and will go on for many thousands of years. So that's the only thing I can promise. I can promise the audience that there will be no answers. We're not going to answer these questions. But I hope by putting these different lights together, there's an image I always have actually. The reason I say lights is that if there is some kind of, idea, some central truth, whatever it is to the universe, you can imagine it. You can imagine shining different lights on it and casting different shadows. So music is one light that casts a shadow, and science is another one, and philosophy is another one. So we have all these shadows, and I think that the aim of this performance is to just use as many of those shadows as possible to illuminate this question in as many ways as we can. Yeah. And then see what happens.
See if you can't approach sufficiency.
I don't think we're going to... I emphasise, I'm not promising anything. I'm not, and anyone... it's true. Anyone who thinks that they have the answer to life, the universe and everything should not be speaking in public. They should be kept away for their own good and the good of everybody else.
And for the public,
so we're
absolutely.
Not claiming that.
Yeah. No, that's very wise. One of the foundational texts of my youth was Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which, remains, I think, the ultimate response to this sort of thing, which is that we may have the answer, but no one actually knew what the question was to start with.
Yeah.
One more question, if you don't mind, on sort of the science of music. I was wondering if you could explain how harmony works. Like, how does physics explain the division of notes and chords and how musical structures actually come together?
Well, there is a mathematical structure in terms of different frequencies. Essentially, we're talking about frequencies and multiples of frequencies that why they're pleasing to us is, I'd say, probably not known. Right? It's an interesting question because, of course, there are different harmonies, different structures of chords and harmony in different cultures, for example, and so part of it's obviously learned. It's a good question. It's an interesting question whether, if we found an alien civilization, they would have music. Would it be based on the same multiples of frequencies, harmonies in the way that we talk about harmonies, scales? I think that's probably unknown. It's easy to guess, yes, because there is a mathematical relationship between notes that sound nice. But what does it mean to sound nice? I don't know. So it's a very good question. And it's funny, actually, because I'm often asked, because I play piano, keyboards. As I mentioned earlier, I was self-taught. So I ended up learning theory, but really jazz theory, because I just wanted to know about chord structures and things. And I'm often asked whether being a scientist, a physicist, a mathematician is a cliche, right? So there's something about being good at physics or maths that allows you to be okay at music. But I don't see it at all, actually. I can see no, and I've thought about it, I can see no common thought process. So I don't know what I'm thinking when I'm playing keyboards, but it's not the same thing that I'm thinking when I'm doing physics. So I don't think there's any connection at all, actually, between the two different fields. Maybe I'm wrong, but I can't see it personally.
Well, I think if you can't see it, there's a reasonable chance that it doesn't exist.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what it is to sit down and play. Really, it's a different state of mind for me, anyway. But I don't read music, so I read chords because I grew up in bands. So if someone shouts A minor 7, D diminished, I just play it, because I'm used to some guitarist shouting out E7. So that's what I do. I just play. If someone shouts a chord at me, I'll play it. Basically.
Well, I guess the people draw connections because of the mathematical relationship between chords, and I suppose an assumption that there's some kind of maths brain at work there thinking, well, I start with this and then we, go down a tritone and then that's that and then that's because of that mathematical relationship.
Yeah, I wonder, because in Zarathustra, the section of science and learning is a fugue, right, which is an intensely mathematical musical structure, and a very, very weird one, actually, very complicated. So that's, Strauss used that form in that to explore or to write the piece of music that goes along with Nietzsche's arguments. I suppose you could say against science. I'm not really sure what the right words are, but in any case, yeah, a fugue is in principle a derived, isn't it, to some extent? Not completely, but it's derivable.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and Pythagoras was convinced that the universe had music in its movements, and that there was a definable, observable music of the spheres, wasn't it? His theory. And
there is it is fascinating the underlying structure of the universe. I'll put it this way: that, as Galileo said, the language. The book of nature is written in the language of mathematics. Galileo said that. Right? And it does seem to be true to this day. It seems that mathematics is a powerful tool to explore nature. There's a great essay by Eugene Wigner, the great theoretical physicist and mathematician, called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Physical Sciences. So it does seem that our universe is amenable to exploration using the language of mathematics. But whether that's always going to be the case, or whether that is indicative of something deeper, some deep mathematical structure, I don't think anybody knows. It's a mystery.
It'll probably be driving people crazy for centuries to come.
Yeah.
Trying to find that underlying structure.
Yeah. But as you said, music has a mathematical underpinning to it. Although, as we've also discussed, a symphony orchestra playing one of these great pieces of music it's an enormously complex organism. I once said I had an argument actually again with my friend Daniel Harding, the conductor. Not an argument; it was one of those intellectual jousting matches. I don't know. We both took a side, right? So I said that I want to know how many bits of information there are in the performance of a symphony. Right? So you could argue it's almost unquantifiable because it's the mood of the musicians and the intention of the composer and the arena, and the audience. It's a live performance, a very complex thing. Or you could argue it's the dots on the page. So we had a wonderful debate. He decided to argue it's just the dots. I don't think he believes that, but he decided to argue it anyway. And we had a fun evening.
Yeah.
Sort of debating what the information, the Mahler 5. What's the information content of that? Is it? You can quantify it. It's the score. Not very much is the answer.
Yeah.
You fit it easily on the most ancient of USB sticks. But is that what that symphony is? Right? I would argue not.
Yeah. Well, interesting position for a conductor to take as well. That it's just the bits, because what's the conductor doing then? Well, another of the great unanswerable questions.
I remember he tried to argue that you could say, what are you trying to do as a conductor? I'm talking now probably out of turn because conductors, they're complicated things, conductors, aren't they? But you could say you're trying to get to the intentions of the writer, right? Of the composer. You could say that, or you could say that the composer gives you this framework, which is more in the spirit of I think what we're doing here. It gives you this framework that's open to that can grow. Which is it? Right, there are people who know a lot more about classical music than I do, who will be shouting at their screen now with a strong opinion. What is it? Are you trying to get to what the composer intended? Are you trying to produce something else?